Hello everyone, and welcome to my Young and the Restless official 24 channel. Genoa City no way saw it coming, not the enchantresses, not the bank entwining into the night sky, not the single man who stepped out of the murk and ended everything in one merciless reach, because when Matt Clark's father eventually revealed himself, it wasn't just a deliverance, it was a reckoning, a controlled obliteration of every taradiddle, every alliance, every power play that had circled his son like predators. And in one unbelievable night the huntsman came to hunt it as. The doors slammed shut, the exits dissolved, and Nick Newman realized too late that the game he allowed he was playing had been outfitted from the launch, because the man standing before him was no ordinary father but a ghost from a once no bone bothered to probe, a man with coffers, reach, and a cold wave, surgical tolerance that made Victor Newman's conglomerate look sloppy by comparison. And as deers burned across the abandoned artificial complex where Matt had been intimately held. The verity exploded alongside them. This wasn't rage, this was strategy, times in the timber, every move calculated, every treason entered, every trouble annulled in advance, and when the sword doors crashed down locking Victor, Nick, Noah, and Sienna outside, fear spread briskly than the fire itself as Victor barked orders that no one could carry out. His authority pointless against a man who had formerly anticipated every contingency, cut every line, jammed every signal, and turned Genoa City's most important family into captures of their own arrogance, because Matt's father didn't raise his voice, didn't bewail, didn't explain himself beyond one ruinous judgment delivered with murderous calm. You took my son, so I take everything, and in that moment Nick felt commodity he hadn't felt in times real fear, not for his character or his freedom, but for his life. As the heat boosted and the walls sounded to close in, Noah crying for his father to do commodity while Sienna collapsed in hysterics, realizing the secrets she vended, the falsehoods she told, and the side she chose had sealed her fate, while Victor, trapped and furious, locked eyes with the man who had outplayed him and honored the verity he despised most, that this was a war he'd formerly lost, because Matt's father hadn't come to negotiate or posture, he came to abolish. And as the fire spread methodically, not hectically but designedly, it came clear this conflagration was finagled, a sanctification blaze designed to destroy substantiation, influence, and the vision of control the Newmans had reckoned on for decades, and outdoors, untouched by the chaos, Matt was carried to safety, slightly conscious but alive, saved by the one person who no way stopped watching, no way stopped preparing, his father's arms steady as he rumored pledges that this agony was over. That no one would ever pen him again, and that Genoa City would pay for every second of suffering foisted on his blood, while inside the locked emulsion Nick screamed Matt's name in despair, realizing too late that every decision, every roadway, every act of atrocity had led to this moment, and when exigency crews eventually arrived they were met with an insolvable scene, fires burning too hot to approach, security systems sealed tight, and no immediate way in or out. While rumors began to ripple through the megacity that Victor Newman himself was trapped. Arrested by circumstance, stripped of power not by law enforcement but by a man who refused to play by their rules, and as the night sky glowed orange over Genoa City, alliances shattered across city in real time, phones buzzing with whispers that the Newmans were finished, that Nick had crossed a line he couldn't retreat from, that Noah's future was in remains, and that Sienna's treason had eventually come due. While Matt's father dissolved just as efficiently as he arrived, leaving behind nothing but ash, unanswered questions, and a megacity forced to reckon with the verity that power doesn't always come from plutocrat or heritage, it comes from tolerance, perfection, and a father who refuses to lose his son. And as dawn approached and the fires eventually failed down, Genoa City stood irrevocably changed, because this wasn't just a deliverance, it was in prosecution of an entire period. A warning sculpted into bank and sword that no bone is untouchable, not indeed Victor Newman, and nearly beyond the megacity limits, Matt opened his eyes, alive, free, and girdled by silence rather of chains, while his father looked on knowing the cost had been high but the communication unmistakable. The game was over, the board was burned, and nothing, absolutely nothing, would ever stand in their way again. Beneath the smoldering remains of what had formerly been a precisely chosen battlefield, Genoa City woke to a dawn that felt wrong, heavy, and irrevocably altered, because the fire that tore through the night didn't just scorch sword and concrete, it burned down certainty, scale, and the implied belief that the Newmans always survived complete, and as exigency lights washed over the wreckage, The Verity settled in with brutal clarity. This wasn't an accident, not a vendetta gone wild, but a perfection strike that left the megacity's most important numbers exposed, lowered, and fairly cornered, as Victor Newman was pulled from the locked structure coughing, furious, and bleeding, his fabulous countenance shattered by the inarguable reality that he'd been overreached by a man whose name still wasn't in any database, whose face cameras ever failed to capture, and whose reach extended far beyond anything Victor had anticipated, while Nick was dragged out moments laterally and bind, his rage giving way to a concave shock as law enforcement read out charges that piled advanced by the alternate, unlawful detainment, conspiracy, inhibition, crimes tied directly to Matt Clark's prison, each word wharf like a hammer blow as Noah cried demurs that no bone heeded to and Sienna blubbed uncontrollably, her precisely drafted alliances dissolving the moment consequences arrived. Because the megacity had formally chosen its narrative, and it was brutal, enduring, and merciless. Matt was the victim, the Newmans were the villains, and Matt's father was the ghost who delivered justice when no bone differently would, and across city, whispers came captions came allegations, and allegations burned a feeding delirium that indeed Victor's influence couldn't silence, as longtime abettors reseated themselves, shareholders shocked, and adversaries smiled still behind unrestricted doors, seeing blood in the water, while at a secure undisclosed position long halls down, Matt lay resting under constant medical supervision, his body bruised but mending, his mind sluggishly waking to the consummation that the agony was truly over, that the chains, physical and cerebral, had been shattered by the one man who no way stopped believing in him, and when Matt eventually spoke, his voice coarse but steady, it wasn't sweat that came through, it was clarity, a sharp resoluteness forged in prison, as he asked not about vengeance but about verity, about exposure, about icing no bone differently ever endured what he had, and his father, standing still hard, didn't argue, didn't soften the edges, simply jounced, because this wasn't the end, it was phase 2, and back in Genoa City the fallout grew unpretty by the hour as Victor demanded his attorneys, only to discover that several had suddenly withdrawn, citing conflicts of interest that felt orchestrated. Nick was denied bail pending disquisition, Noah's name was plastered across every screen with Enterprise swirling about his part, and Sienna's frantic attempts to spin the story collapsed under substantiation that surfaced with intimidating speed, documents, recordings, digital trails that should no way have was but did, as if someone had anticipated every taradiddle she might tell and prepared the counterpunch in advance, and while the Newmans climbed to contain the damage, Jack Abbott watched from a distance, torn between satisfaction and apprehension, because this takedown didn't feel like business, it felt particular, surgical, and impregnable, and indeed he, with all his experience, tasted that stepping into this war would be fatal, while Sharon bothered about Noah's unraveling, knowing the weight of guilt and fear could destroy him long before any verdict did, and as Victor eventually recaptured enough countenance to issue pitfalls from his sanitarium bed, promising retribution, exposure, and revenge, the trouble chimed concave, because for the first time in decades, no bone was hysterical, not when the man who burned down the board had formally dissolved, leaving behind not chaos but order, and also, just as the megacity began to believe the peril had passed, a new shockwave hit, an anonymous drop transferred contemporaneously to major outlets, law enforcement, and commercial trolls, outlining times of buried secrets tied to Newman operations. Unconnected at first regard but ruinous in their compass, substantiation so strictly collected it forced immediate examinations on multiple fronts, and Victor knew in his bones who was responsible, knew this was the father's final communication, a memorial that mercy had formerly been shown by allowing survival, and as public trust in the Newman name collapsed, board members turned on each other, adoptions rolled by, and the conglomerate that formerly sounded untouchable began to crack from the inside, while Nick, alone in a holding cell, replayed every choice that led him then, every warning ignored, every moment he believed he was untouchable, until the verity eventually settled this wasn't bad luck or treason, it was consequence, and nearly beyond the reach of cameras and courts, Matt stood beside his father watching the news unfold, equivocal but bent, knowing the deers had been necessary, knowing Genoa City demanded to see that power abused invites obliteration, and when asked if he felt guilt, Matt answered still that survival occasionally looks like destruction to those who erected their lives on control, and his father, eyes fixed on the horizon, said nothing, because he understood commodity. The Newmans no way did this was end about winning, it was about ending cycles, and as the sun set on a megacity still choking on bank and reproach, one verity echoed louder than any temptress or caption: Genoa City would no way be the same, the Newmans would no way reclaim what was lost, and the man who saved his son had rewritten the rules. Ever, leaving behind a heritage not of fear, but of futurity, because when he ended the game, he didn't just deliver Matt, he burned the vision that anyone could ever pen them again. By the third day after the fire, Genoa City stopped pretending this was just another reproach and began defying the uncomfortable verity that it was living through a reckoning, because the bank had cleared but the damage kept spreading outward like unnoticeable cracks in glass, and every institution that formerly bent automatically to Newman pressure suddenly dithered, stalled, or outright refused, as if the megacity itself had exhaled after decades of holding its breath, and Victor Newman felt it far and wide, from the colder tone of croakers who no longer remitted, to the cropped responses from judges who formerly took his calls, to the boardroom silence that saluted his name with computation rather of reverence, while Nick, insulated and stripped of his usual bravado, learned how long a night can stretch when there's no bone left to fix effects for you, replaying the moment Matt's father looked him in the eye, not with abomination but with certainty, a certainty that felt worse, because it meant this outgrowth had always been ineluctable, and Noah, released but under constant scrutiny, wandered Genoa City like a ghost, unfit to escape the weight of knowing he'd followed a plan that ended with lives ruined and in conglomerate burning, while Sienna, abandoned by everyone she'd trusted, cut a deal so presto it shocked indeed the prosecutors, handing over everything she had in exchange for protection, not realizing that the most ruinous substantiation had formerly been delivered without her help, making her treason feel meaningless, pathetic, and tragically late, and as the legal walls closed in, Victor eventually did what he hadn't done in times, he admitted fear, not audibly, not to anyone who could use it against him, but in the quiet moments when the sanitarium room darkened and he goggled at the ceiling, fating that the man who destroyed him didn't need to appear again, because the damage was formerly tone sustaining, the collapse formerly in stir, and meanwhile Matt returned to Genoa City under an assumed name, moving through thoroughfares that formerly represented peril now filled with conservative freedom, watching non-natives argue over his story, hearing opinions about his prison, his deliverance, his father, without any of them knowing he was right there, alive and unbroken, and when he stood across from the remains of the burned emulsion, he didn't feel triumph, only a strange calm, because the place where his fear had peaked was now nothing further than blackened debris, helpless and silent, and that was when he understood what his father had given him, not vengeance, but release, and as weeks passed, the anonymous drops continued, not as explosions but as surgical gates, just enough to keep examinations alive, just enough to help agreements, just enough to ensure that every attempt by Victor to recapture footing was met with resistance he couldn't bulldoze through, while Jack Abbott cautiously maneuvered into the vacuum, knowing occasion infrequently announces itself this easily, and yet indeed Jack dithered, seeing that whatever force had disassembled the Newmans wasn't finished shaping the fate. And sure enough, a final move arrived not with fire but with evidence, when Matt, standing higher than anyone anticipated, walked into a civil structure adjoined not by attorneys empty for exposure but by quiet professionals who treated him like someone whose words carried weight, and in a room thick with pressure he told the verity, not theatrically, not emotionally, but methodically, dismembering every defense, every reason, every narrative the Newmans had reckoned on, and when he finished, no bone questioned him, because the clarity of his account left no room for mistrustfulness, and outdoors, as news broke that formal complaints were imminent, Genoa City replied with a blend of shock and grim satisfaction, because this wasn't gossip presently, it was history being written, and Victor, watching from behind glass, eventually understood the depth of his defeat, realizing too late that the father he dismissed as a problem had raised a son who would come the final substantiation, the living evidence that power fails when it loses its humanity, and when sentencing sounds impended and alliances faded. Victor asked to see Nick, not to map, not to console, but to say the words that had no way come fluently, that they had undervalued the wrong man, and Nick, eyes concave, said nothing, because justifications do'n't rebuild what arrogance destroys, and on a quiet evening far from Genoa City's noise, Matt sat with his father overlooking a stretch of land untouched by heritage or ambition, and when he asked if it was eventually over, his father answered actually that some consequences echo longer than others, but that the peril had passed, the trouble annulled, the cycle broken, and as the megacity moved forward, rebuilding, reshuffling, rewriting its power structure, one story remained unchanged, rumored not as a warning but as a memorial that one man, driven not by pride or control but by love, had walked into Genoa city, saved his son, burned down an conglomerate without asking authorization, and left behind a verity no bone could forget, that when a father decides the game is over, indeed legends fall, and nothing ever stands the same again. Long after the court forms, the sounds, the endless commentary, Genoa city discovered that the real damage from that night hadn't been confined to captivity walls or balance wastes but had strained into the megacity's bloodstream, altering how people looked at power, fidelity, and sweat itself, because once the myth of ineluctability dies, the myth that certain families always win, everything becomes unstable, and Victor Newman felt that insecurity like vertigo as he stood in a visit room weeks latterly, aged ever, lowered not by age but by exposure, hearkening as attorneys spoke in careful tones about timelines, sentencing ranges, and limited influence, expressions that would have been laughable a month before, while Nick sat across from him, shoulders drooped, eventually stripped of the restless confidence that formerly defined him, both men visited by the same consummation that the father they undervalued no way demanded to pull the detector again, because the collapse was now automatic, tone immortalizing, impregnable, and Noah, watching his family unravel from the outside, entwined between guilt and resentment, furious at Victor for dragging them into a war they couldn't win and furious at himself for believing obedience equaled safety, while Sienna, dislocated under protection, learned the cruel irony of survival, that escaping captivity didn't mean escaping consequence, that every glass reflected a woman who traded humanity for propinquity to power and lost both, and as Genoa city's nobility climbed to budge themselves, Gemütlichkeit faded overnight, marriages strained under rumored allegations, and old adversaries resurfaced inspired by the unforeseen absence of fear, because fear had been the Newman currency for decades, and now it was empty, while Matt, still rebuilding his life, discovered that freedom came with its own vertigo, moments where silence felt too loud, where open doors touched off reflexive fear, and yet with each passing day the recollections loosened their grip, replaced not by revenge but by purpose, as he began speaking intimately with lawyers, investigators, and still devastated families who honored pieces of their own stories in his, and although his father remained in the background, vigilant and subdued, his presence was constant, grounding, a memorial that protection didn't have to mean control, and as the megacity shifted, a new conflict surfaced, not violent, not explosive, but ideological as Victor's patriots tried to reframe the narrative, painting the fire as terrorism, the father as a felonious architect, Matt as a manipulated pawn, a strategy that might have worked formerly, but this time the megacity defied, because too numerous trueness had surfaced, too numerous patterns exposed, and when an unanticipated whistleblower from within Newman Enterprises stepped forward, corroborating Matt's evidence with documents that traced compulsion back times, the last remaining protectors fell silent, and indeed Jack Abbott, serving still from the power vacuum, set up himself uneasy, apprehensive that the rules he'd learned were no longer dependable, that Genoa city had crossed into a new period where brute influence invited retribution rather of submission, while Victor, facing sentencing, requested one final statement, not to the press but to Matt, a meeting that gurgled through the megacity when it blurted, and in that sterile room, stripped of titles and pitfalls, Victor eventually brazened the mortal cost of his choices, speaking not with dominance but with sick defiance, averring he'd done what men like him always do, cover their heritage at any cost, and Matt heeded without interruption before answering with ruinous simplicity that heritage erected on coops deserves to burn, a judgment that dallied long after the guards ended the visit, and when the verdicts eventually came down. Harsh, definitive, insolvable to spin, Genoa city didn't erupt in festivity or outrage but commodity quieter, heavier, like collaborative exhale, as if the megacity itself conceded a debt paid at terrible cost, while Nick was led down in silence, Noah watched his unborn narrow, and Victor Newman, formerly untouchable, came another important man undone by believing love was weakness, and outside the courthouse, Matt's father stood compactly, unnoticed by cameras, before turning down. His work complete, not because everyone had suffered enough, but because the cycle had been broken, the warning delivered, and as months passed, new leaders rose, new alliances formed, and the scars of that night remained etched into Genoa City's identity, rumored to beginners as legend rather than trouble, a story about a man who loved his son further than power loved itself. And in a modest home far from the skyline that formerly represented peril, Matt slept peacefully for the first time in times, the echoes eventually fading, while his father watched the horizon with quiet resoluteness, knowing that he hadn't just saved his son, he'd changed the rules of survival ever, and Genoa City, rebuilt on ash and verity, would no way again mistake dominance for fortune.